let me get started. Can you show the others? No, that's okay. We're going to be talking about dogwoods and because, well, we had a beautiful spring for dogwoods, and they are an important part of our landscape here in the East. They're sort of like the harbingers of spring. You know, spring's here when the dogwoods are out. So next slide. Okay, there are, a lot of us think of the white flowering dogwood, Cornus florida, when we think of dogwoods. And they probably are the most prevalent. They are native throughout the eastern United States. That's a wide range of zones that they live in, and they have adapted well. They're a spring landscape favorite. They're a really good tree because they're sort of they can adapt to sun or shade. They do better in one or the other. They are smallish, and they're beautiful. They also provide year-round interest. They're, you know, even when they're bare in the wintertime, they have the buds that are going to open in the spring, and when the snow falls on them, they're really pretty. And then when they bloom, they're quite amazing. And at least for the first part of after the blooms fade and the leaves come out, they look pretty good. Sometimes not so good at the end, but when they do turn, the leaves turn a beautiful color, if they're more so if they're out in the sun. And you can also see many pink and red cultivars that are super popular because they are beautiful. Now the what appears to be what we would call flowers are actually modified leaves. So they are, that's a little different. The center of that flower, what appears to be a flower, is the actual flower that does produce the fruit. Next slide, please. Okay, there are other native species that are really very nice too. Some will say that the red twigs are not natives, but I have my information that I used said that they were. There's one that I left out, which is also really attractive, called a pagoda dogwood. There's more information about that in the link that is on the opening slide if you want to check out some really good information about the whole history and all. The Cornelian Cherry is an early one. It's, if you want a sequence of dogwood blooms, it blooms early with yellow flowers, very small yellow flowers on multiple trunk tree, and the blooms last quite a while before the fruit shows up. And it's a cherry-like fruit. It's actually usable for cooking and for wildlife. But if you don't want to make fruit out of jam or something out of it, it does create a mess, kind of a messy area under it. So that would be a consideration if you have a small yard and don't want to have to deal with that. It grows in from zone 4 to 7. So we are sort of at the peak of the hottest spot for growing this kind. The red twig dogwoods as well, they prefer the cooler zones. They're really great up in the areas like where we lived in Rochester. We had red twig dogwoods and they were spectacular. They're more shrub-like. They sucker and make a big, they get bushy and go out you don't really have to do much with them. They don't have, just like the Cornelian cherry, they do not have a whole lot of problems with diseases or pests really either. So some of them also have they've developed some varieties with variegated foliage, which are really attractive, and there are some with yellow stems. The only problem is, and if you have in a hot microclimate, they can get kind of suffer. As all dogwoods, they need lots of water. They are shallow rooted. They don't, drought can really damage them. Oh, next slide, please. Okay, there's a picture of a Cornelian cherry and the fruit. As you can see, it's pretty good size. And this one they have grown as a single trunk tree, but I've seen others where they say they can be trimmed into a hedge if you want a barrier type shrubby way to use it in your landscape. Next slide, please. Okay, there is a picture of a red twig dogwood in winter, and that is the main reason why I think a lot of people buy them, because they really are attractive in the winter. You can see it was probably a very small plant, but it spreads rapidly. And these are my friend's two varieties. One I think has orangey yellow stems, this one in the middle, and the other one shows the blooms on the red twig, the really red twigged one. They've just finished. So they do bloom, but the blooms are really not all that exciting. So next slide. Okay, this is a picture of a Aquila dogwood. Now, I'm sure everybody is familiar with those because people started using them a lot when our native Cornus Florida species began to have its problem with diseases. So these were planted because they are more disease-free, actually, and they bloom a little later. They bloom after the leaves have formed, but this is early. They're not a greenish color like this. They get white too, and their blooms actually last for about 6 weeks. So they're very nice. But once again, they have fruit, and it's pretty big. Kind of looks like a raspberry. I think they even call it a strawberry tree in Japan. And that can be messy too in a small yard, or even though it is also edible by humans. They say I read that that it is not particularly favored by our wildlife, that they haven't really come to like it a whole lot, although they say squirrels do eat them. And some of those have amazing variegated foliage and make a very nice specimen tree. They keep a nice shape, and they don't have many pests. So another thing about them, because of their resistance and to disease, they have been crossed with natives to create Rutgers hybrids, which are resistant to Discula, Anthracnose, which we will talk about later. It's a fatal disease of dogwood trees. Next slide. Okay, so one thing I doesn't really belong on this slide, but a lot of people, when they see a dogwood seedling in the woods, they'll think, well, I'll just take this home and plant it. Well, it's just not advisable, because they might have some of the funguses that you do not want to bring to your own yard. So here is a list of the Rutgers hybrids that are available, that have been found to be very resistant to disease, and they have the characteristics of both plants with color and shape. But they are, and now maybe another advantage is, as hybrids, they are sterile, so you wouldn't have the fruit drop. So, and the other one, Cornus Florida, was actually found quite a long time ago and developed at the University of Tennessee. It was found in Maryland at Camp David, the small wild one, and they have developed it as a variety that is very popular because of its resistance to anthracnose and Discula anthracnose and other fungus diseases. Next slide. Okay, now a lot of people will go out and buy a dogwood. It's still a good time to plant them, but as it gets warmer, it's not. The best time to plant them is really in fall if you can't get it done early now. But they prefer, as with everything, the right site is a very important consideration. So it's the way you get a tree off to a good start. So they like slightly acidic soil. Some say 5 to 6, so it's very narrow. And also it needs, because it has a shallow root system, it needs to have a little cleared space around it, so it doesn't have to share water with all of the other plants around. Although I have one that's succeeding very well with quite a few plants around. The one in the front has a lot of plants around it, and it's not. So that's on the south side, not doing as well. Good air circulation is really important for any plant, no matter what, and dogwoods are no exception. So sometimes that might mean you have to take away some of the vegetation that's around it or thin it itself. Okay, and mulching to conserve moisture, that's obvious. If you're a shallow rooted plant and that is in a sunny spot, is going to evaporate a lot of moisture through transpiration. So it's going to need a lot during the warm weather. So mulching it is one way to help it conserve moisture. And also, when you plant it in a lawn, there are two things to consider. If you plant it all the way up to the base with, most people don't do this, with only a small mulch ring, there's always the risk of the string trimmers and the lawnmowers nicking the trunk. And that's one of the problems that get a disease started, is bark damage. The other thing is lawn fertilizer a lot of times has a lot of nitrogen, and the dogwood trees a lot of nitrogen will make them get a lot of new shoots that might be susceptible to the diseases. So you hear a lot of different opinions about shade or filtered sun. I think filtered sun is probably the best option for keeping the tree from getting leaf scorch, and but not if it's too shady, it will be more susceptible to the fungus diseases. Okay, next slide. So what you're trying to do with any plant is minimizing the stressors. And so with a dogwood, stressors meaning things that kind of inhibit its natural growth and cause it to have problems. Drought is the big one for dogwoods. I found out about that the hard way. I thought my front dogwood had Discula anthracnose. We had just learned about it in class, and I was sure that it had it. And I took it to a garden center, and he said, it's just needs to be fed and watered. So I've been more careful now about thorough watering during drought. The lawn sprinkler system is not going to water a tree well enough to make it, keep it healthy. You just have to do additional watering. And bark damage, lawn equipment, also pruning. If you think you're going to need to prune it during damp, cool weather in early spring, is going to be a way to introduce a pathogen if you cause wounds. So a source I read said, wait for the warm, hot, dry weather, but not too late. It's a caution here, because as soon as the blooms are gone and the leaves are out, it's going to start making its new buds for next year, and you don't want to cut those off or you will not have as many blooms. And the poor air circulation, once again, thin the canopy, remove the surrounding vegetation that blocks the airflow. My back one is planted near the, what do they call, the heat pump things that blow air out, the condenser things that are outside for your air conditioning and heat, and that blows all the time, and they've never had any fungus at all. That one hasn't. So next slide, please. Okay, powdery mildew. How do we, I would love to know how to avoid this, but it seems to be everywhere. I mean, there are lots of plants that are susceptible, and the flowering dogwood, the Cornus florida, is very susceptible. And I think one of the reasons is probably that the leaves, if it's in too much shade, the leaves don't get thoroughly dried out by the end of the day. And that just, if there are any spores there, it's the fungus spores do overwinter in material, including any leaves you've left on the ground. So one of the most important things you can do, well, as soon as they get it and the leaves drop off, but in the fall, is to make sure you've gotten all of the leaves up that have fallen off that dogwood tree. Whether you saw mildew or not, I think it's better to just pick up all the dropped dogwood leaves. So the thing is, most of the time it doesn't happen until late summer, and it's not going to look too good, but putting a fungicide on it, well, that would be your decision, but it is probably not going to really be worth it if it's, late in the summer. It's most of it's the bloom time is past. But I named 3 of the fungicides that were suggested by our pest management guide. They also pertain to neem oil. Is kind of, it's one that doesn't have the potential, as much potential risk to pollinators. But the best way to prevent fungus is the cultural practices. Rake up the fallen leaves, maybe even the mulch that had the leaves were on, to get rid of the pathogen. The next slide, please. Okay, here's 2 pictures to compare the 2 kinds of anthracnose. This picture on the left is my tree just beginning to show the spots. They actually were on the blooms. They, what we call the blooms. They show up as kind of pink spots. So I knew I was in for it again. But if I feed the tree and water it, it will be able to sustain this much of a fungus infestation. But on the tree on the right has the dogwood anthracnose, the serious disease of dogwoods that started showing up in the late 70s and 80s, and just taking out a lot of the dogwoods in the east. I think they have traced the source of that anthracnose to the Coosa dogwoods that were brought in, and so our native trees had not developed with this fungus and were at much higher risk for not being able to to deal with that disease. So a lot of them die, and it is a quick act. Oh, now that you can see the spot, they actually start out with spots, but then the spots coalesce and turn into what looks like leaf scorch almost. And what happens also is that it will affect the twigs and stems and branches, and they get canker. And you can see it on where a stem will attach to a branch. It will be a canker that will destroy the tissue, and the leaves just end up drooping because they've been cut off from their xylem, and they get no moisture and no nutrition. So they don't even drop off the tree, they just hang. So next slide, please. Okay, all right. This is more of a description of what the spot anthracnose looks like. I mean, is like, their spots are small, like you could see on the slide before, small tan spots, and they have a reddish purple border, and they can get bigger. It's also on the flower bracts and the young shoots. And it said on the fruit, especially during wet spring weather, which would be this year, they may become distorted. The leaves are, the little spots are already coalescing on some of the leaves and distorting the leaves, it looks like leaf scorch, but when you look closer, it's little spots. No significant damage if you keep the tree healthy. But if it loses leaves and vigor, and several years in a row, it might be fatal to it. So here are the fungicides. If you have a severe infection early on, that would be a good thing to do, to apply these fungicides. Okay, next slide. Okay, dogwood anthracnose, called Discula destructiba. It causes tan spots too, with purple edges, and dry brown margins and then the large blotches come together. They start low in the tree and progress upward, and then the leaves droop. You think that, well, it doesn't look even like fall. They just look very sick, and the cankers form on the twigs and branches. Now, the one difference between the two anthracnoses, the spot anthracnose does not affect the branches. The cankers on this kind of Discula anthracnose can girdle the tree and kill it, and it takes about 2 or 3 years if it's not treated, or not, if you don't do these cleanups, if you don't cut out the diseased material and fix its circumstances, its air circulation, it will probably succumb in a couple of years, 2 to 3 years. So one important thing about fungicides, it suggested that you alternate them. If you're doing treatments, you don't stick with one, because it can prevent development of resistance to the fungicide. Oh, next slide, please. Okay, more spots. There's the Septorial leaf spot is, you're familiar with that from many other plants that it affects. This one, happens during wet summer, and it has more dark browns, purple spots with a light brown or gray center. They look a lot alike, but it said the spots are more angular and more consistent in size than those of Discula Anthracnose. And it usually occurs near the end of the growing season, so you don't really need to treat it if you don't want to use chemicals. Just do the cleanup. All right, next slide, please. Okay, common pests. This is the most common pest. This is the adult for the dogwood borer. It looks, this is not a good picture of it. It actually looks like a wasp with clear wings. It's a clear wing moth, but it looks a lot like a wasp. It has a little squared off tail at the bottom. It lays its eggs in wounds and in the bark, especially at the bottom. You'll see it will, places where there's been nicked or pruning cuts, it will lay its eggs in there, and they move around underneath the bark and take out the xylem and phloem, and so there will be dead areas above that. And as with all borers, there's a hole that their waste can come. You'll see it coming out of in a little sawdusty kind of tube. Next slide, please. Okay, all right. Prevention is always the best. You just keep your trees healthy, and it really does. The borers really go for the unhealthy trees. So watering, fertilizing, and mulching, avoiding bark damage, remove and dispose. That's the one thing you do prune, is the infested limbs should be disposed of, not in your mulch, in your compost pile, or even what you put out on the street. It needs to be bagged and put in the garbage. You can, if you know you have an infestation, spray with one of these chemicals every 3 weeks from May through July, to prevent them from laying the eggs. All right, next slide, please. Okay, and there's another one. I saw a picture of it. It's a club gall midge. It's a really tiny fly that lays the eggs in the terminal leaves of the branches, and the larvae feed and make a gall, but it's not like a round gall. It's a long, skinny gall that looks like a club, and it said only heavy infestations are likely to kill the tree. And scales of several different kinds they seem to be everywhere. They, just like all scale, feed on the sap of the leaves and stems, and you will notice the damage, and you will probably also see the honeydew, twig dieback, and yellowing leaves. But since they're armored scale, you would need to catch them during the crawler stage in order to treat them with a spray. Otherwise, you would have to use a drench to get them, because they are armored. So you spray, find out the particular stage, the crawler time for the particular scale that you have on your tree, and that's when you treat. Next slide, please. Okay, is it time for this?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Now planting, I have seen people who just dig a hole as big as the root ball and put the plant in, and it's hard to imagine that it has a chance. Who knows? But they suggest that you just dig the hole as deep as the root ball, but as much wider, because this dogwood is going to send out its roots almost at the surface. So you need to improve the soil, but not just add good soil. It has to mix with the soil that is nearby, because otherwise the roots will stay in that hole and not reach out further. So some people say 1/3 of the old soil, 1/2. Anyway, mixed together. Do not plant the tree below the level of the flare, where the trunk comes down to the ground, and then backfill it and water it thoroughly. They suggest watering it, filling it halfway, and then watering that, and then backfilling the rest, and then make a little basin around it for catching water with the soil that's left over from the hole. And next slide, please. Okay, that was it. Besides these resources, the slide at the very beginning has a really great, if you can look at that again, it has a really good article from the Piedmont Master Gardeners about dogwoods. It's really a super article with much more information than I've given you.
And somebody asked, what is a good fertilizer?
Oh, okay. I did read about that. You do not want a high nitrogen fertilizer, for one thing. And they said to avoid in your lawn around the dogwood, not to use the high nitrogen fertilizer. A slow release fertilizer, it suggested 2-1-1, the kind that you might use on azaleas. But a slow release fertilizer was what was recommended. And it was recommended at early in the spring, as soon as the ground was not frozen anymore. And then 6 weeks later, to help the plant set new buds for the following year.